Okay, sound test, Danny, 1, 2. Georgi, sound test.
Sound test.
Jahed, sound test.
Sound test.
Okay, we are live. We're talking about if Ray is a gun owner or not. I have Jahed, Momand, and Georgi Dinkov. Guys, thank you so much. Sincerely appreciate you guys bearing with us. This has been a insane trying to set this up with 3 people has been extremely challenging, and I'm not a boomer tech, but I was in this instance. So thank you, everybody, for bearing with me. Sincerely appreciate it. How are you guys?
Good, man. How you doing?
Good. We were having a super intense conversation, and so we're just going to carry that over right into this. But I actually, I think a good foray into that would, Jahed, you actually talked to Ray about this, but I have it on screen. And Ray, I forget what question you asked him, but Ray replied, the reason I talk more about biology than politics is that the various radical movements generally have inflexibilities that keep them apart. People need to start understanding that the system is systematically murdering them, and that understanding that the situation is desperate, they need to see that solidarity with life against capital is their hope. And so you got a gem out of him. And so do you want to maybe give a little background on that conversation?
Oh, sure. So the subject line of this email was colonization, mitochondria, psychosis, and possibilities, etc. I just had a random ass thought, and I was like, oh, I should email Ray and talk to him about this, because I've met him in person. We've talked about politics and stuff like that. I'm not going to tell you what he is because it'd probably just make all of you mad.
Well, I've upset people. Like I think there's a huge bend maybe on YouTube or whatever for libertarian thought, and I think he kind of elegantly spoke about why he was. I don't know what Ray is either. I don't know if he's, but we talked about libertarianism in my interviews with him. But I don't know. Do you want to talk about
Ray? Ray was talking about libertarianism.
Well, I've talked to him on my podcast and things, but I thought this was the idea that the system was murdering them is I think a more important than the factions of different political movements, which people set to get into.
Yeah, so I sent him this email, and I was basically telling him I had just finished. I think I had just finished Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, which is kind of it's kind of now become like a tanky fable. So if any anarchists are watching, it's like, what, he read Frantz Fanon? No, it's fine. I just was doing some research. But Frantz Fanon, if you don't know who he is, he was a psychiatrist and revolutionary socialist from I believe it was Martinique. And then when he was pretty young, he through the French government, because Martinique was a French colony, he went to France and studied medicine and became a psychiatrist in the sort of, I believe it was the psychoanalysis tradition, which was still kind of big back then in the 20s and 30s. And then, halfway through that, he got radicalized by the French, the decolonization movements that were happening. And so he went to, Algeria, where there was a revolution against the French. And he was there as a state employee, actually. He was employed by the French to be a psychiatrist to the French, colonialists, right, who were just ravaging Algeria. And he delved deeply into the trauma experienced by colonizers and the colonized. And so what I'd said to Ray was I think that even if you live in a Western society like the U.S., you're still internally colonized by capital with all of the sort of concomitant responses, physiological and otherwise, unless you're rich. And what I mean by internally colonized is that, there's I typically, when we had some of our calls, I used to pull books out and be like, in this book, they talk about whatever, right? Where's that one? There's this guy, I'll show it later if anyone's interested. But in this book, Seeing Like a State, this Yale historian and political scientist talks about what internally colonized by capital means. Basically, like the administrative structures of capitalism really started on colonialism. Really, like the nobles and the aristocracy of all these rich countries heavily resisted being administered by kings and by governments. They absolutely would make sure that their estates were hard to measure. They paid as little tax as they possibly could. They made it really difficult to have a functioning state. But then when you had other places, when you colonize other places, you could start from scratch. You could literally be like, let's get our data tables out. Let's get some really good cadastral mapping of all the plots. Let's make the peasants, the new colonial subjects, do exactly what we say. So then those structures migrated to the home states eventually, because they perfected them on like these colonial subjects, right? So that's what internally colonized by capital means. And Ray talks about this stuff a lot, right? He talks about learned helplessness. He talks about that kind of stuff. So then I asked him, I was like, I wanted to ask you, how do you deal with what can be, parsed as learned helplessness via just, understanding our environment and the social forces shaping it and some of the nihilistic outlooks, right? Like, whether or not you believe in climate change or, like all the other various things that we're supposed to worry about. And then I told him, I've shared this paper with you, Danny, but it's a pretty cool paper by Douglas Wallace. He's like one of the world's foremost mitochondria scientists. He's the one who discovered the matrilineal inheritance of.
I think I quote the shit out of that paper.
Yeah, it's a fucking great paper, right? But so I referenced it to Ray, and I was like, I think it's clear that mitochondria are the center of the organism's response to stress in both acute and chronic cases. They modulate the organism's response to stress, as you pointed out many times. But it's important to emphasize that the perception of stress is also experienced, internalized, reacted to, right? This much is absolutely true, at least in rats, right? Like rats experiencing restraint stress. So then what is this like over time if you're a person, right? And then the next thing is, which is what got this response out of him, was like, is it possible for us to address these issues with nutritional, supplemental, and chemical means alone? Or do we need to organize ourselves, our minds, and our actions in such a way that ultimately leads to better possibilities for us? If our perception of our condition is dark and this perception and experience is true, what is to be done? Right? And, Georgi might know who I'm quoting at the end of that question with the what is to be done. I'm not a Leninist, but I'm quoting Vladimir Lenin, in case you're wondering. And so Ray was just thinking, I've been thinking of my November newsletter as a survey of the substantial links between energetic and formative processes and our meaning structures, the reality we live in. The perception of possibility can make the energetic difference for a rat of swimming for hours instead of drowning immediately. But the reason I talk about biology more than politics is that the various radical movements generally have inflexibilities that keep them apart. People need to start understanding, the rest of it, right? And so, like, that's where that came from. Because really, I was just like, if you read this stuff, just for an opinion on serotonin or a hormone or some kind of chemical, you might be missing the other point, which is that your ability to react to circumstances, your perception of your own position, is also having effect on all of your physiological structures, I think. And so, but if that's the case, most people are only concentrating on their nutritional supplements and their chemicals they're taking, their diet, their sleep, and all that, all sort of at the individual level. And so that's why I thought it'd be interesting to hear you think about, what does the old 84-year-old, 83-year-old Ray Peat think about organizing and other things?
Well, I think it was Maslow who said, like, society should be basically an adaptive tool to help a person cope with stress. And then if you survey the current environment, it's basically the exact opposite of that. And so, and I think Ray has another quote where it's like, the environment is the continuation of the organism. Like, the organism doesn't end at its skin. And so if again, you're out, I don't know if I'm bastardizing what you're saying, but if your society or whatever is just 100% stressful, you're right. It could be kind of, it might help a little bit to like get better nutrition and stuff, but you're still going to be like chasing your tail basically.
Yeah. Didn't Warburg say that, was it Warburg or Linus Pauling who said that being well adapted to a profoundly sick society is absolutely no measure of success, right? So if that's the case, then I personally see the diet and the supplements simply as an eye opener, right? Like the red pill, as various sites claim, to realize.
Jahed not happy about that.
Oh, I don't
I
care.
mean,
That's fine.
no, I'm just using it because it's a common meme
Yeah.
online.
Yeah.
So you use the diet and the supplements to open your eyes and realize you have a problem and maybe acquire a little bit of a strength, but then the real fight is it has to go beyond just nutrition and supplements. They by themselves are not going to change your life, right? At least not they're not going to change the direction. At best, they're allowing it to adapt to the suboptimally adapt to the current stressful situation. But the real goal should be change the world.
Changing your circumstances, exactly right. And that's not done by just focusing on yourself and your own experience.
Exactly.
And I mean, like you could go to a lot of places with that. Like humans are social animals. We, for whatever reason, have. Actually, this takes me to kind of a cool place. I've talked about this with you before, I think, Danny. But there's this theory in the psychology of behavior change called self-determination theory. It's like the most communal, like communist thing I've seen in academic literature, but it sprung out of studies of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation like in the 1970s. And what they were trying to do was they were trying to answer a very simple question. They were just trying to ask, hey, if we take some humans who like doing a thing out of its own intrinsic like worth and we pay them to do this thing, what happens to their motivation to do that thing?
Yeah.
And so out of that sprung self-determination theory, where they basically realized that when you pay people to do things they love or that they tend to do out of duty, love, or a sense of community, over time their ability to do that and their motivation to do it is blunted, right? And so what's interesting is that there's like three parts of that theory. There's basically they were able to find in later studies and repeated studies of this phenomenon, actually, like this is a pretty replicable theory now, is that humans have a basic psychological need for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And so what you'll see, I haven't talked to Ray about this much, but basically you can think of circumstances that kind of cause, even in like Hans Selye's original gas experiments, that for general adaptation syndrome, that kind of approximate what happens to a person when they're cut off from relatedness, from I didn't even tell you what those three are, right? Like autonomy is very simply defined as like you have agency in the world and you can actually feel that things you do can actually change things,
right,
or have an effect in the world, right? Competence, are you getting better at the things that you want to get better at, and is there a feedback mechanism for you to do that, right? Or whenever something happens, you just get no feedback. And then relatedness, pretty straightforward. Are you strengthening your connections to the people that you value? Are they getting strong? Are those connections stronger? Are they growing? Are they going the way you want them to? So there's some pretty straightforward studies, on like the rat restraint stress ones, right? Because it's kind of unethical to do this shit on humans, but it turns out that we do it anyway with things like solitary confinement, right? And you've seen that, like, if this was merely a function of nutrition, if you put a person in solitary confinement but you fed them, they'd be totally fine. But they're not. They get fucked up, right? Like they're completely ravaged. Their hair falls out. They get ulcers. They get higher risk of cancer. All kinds of things, right? So clearly, these basic psychological needs, given who we are now as social animals and how we got here, you can mostly say that they're empirically necessary until we figure out in the future, some other way of being that isn't meat space, being bags of water, as they like to say.
I have something to add to that, to the solitary confinement. Remember the rat park experiment? The one that showed that addiction really comes from like stressful circumstances.
Yeah.
It turns out that people who basically spend even a week in solitary confinement, they did a study on that. I have to find an incident to you guys. But basically, over their the time that they spend in prison, the overwhelming majority of them develop a substance abuse problem. But the general prison population has a much lower rate of substance abuse problem. So it's kind of like we already have the human data as well. If you put people in solitary confinement, which is the equivalent of the cage for the rat, of course they're going to do anything to reduce their pain. And think of how much more difficult it is for a person in prison to get access to drugs and alcohol, yet they still do it regardless of the risks, because if they get caught, I mean, they get thrown again in solitary confinement, right? They probably for even longer. Yet they don't care. They're actually willing to risk all of that just to get their fix. So we kind of have not the rat park experiment. We already have the human park experiment.
Exactly.
And it's been published.
Yeah. Well, Jahed, I couldn't categorize your, again, this show is not about politics per se, but how that interweaves with stress and energy, et cetera. And I think you have to have a realistic view of the world you're living in to combat the stresses of life. But I would have a hard time pinpointing what your point of view is, because you use the word an anarchist, but I think at least in the channels that I'm familiar with, that's usually used as like an anarcho-capitalist point of view, but I know that's not what you think.
Oh, I mean,
you're like a Kropotkin style anarchist, right?
Not even that really, but I don't want to. I mean, I'm not trying to hijack the whole YouTube podcast to talk about politics. I will say that with respect to Ray, you can kind of wink at and nudge a little bit when you read things like anti-authoritarian. It's pretty straightforward. That's also why, like, when I asked you when you've talked about him about libertarianism before, he probably thinks you mean American libertarianism, which is very ANCAP. Like, it's basically, the whole, I guess we could kind of take a tangent on this, but like the sort of American anarcho-capitalist stuff started out of a few people, particularly was it Murray Rothbard and F.A. Hayek were kind of like the big intellectual giants.
Well, Ray always mentions the Koch brothers as being prominent.
Yeah, but that's much, much later. Like, we're talking about propagandists for views of people who actually originated them, right? Those, like the Kochs, were just throwing gas on a fire. They didn't actually sit there and try to do the scholarly work of saying, here's what it is, right? That was more of the economic thinkers like Murray Rothbard and F.A. Hayek, who, like, I think most of Murray Rothbard shit is just dumb as hell, but like, I'm not really going to get into why. Whereas F.A. Hayek stuff is good, good for like the wrong reasons in some areas, particularly like, Hayek spent a lot of time talking about state socialism and accurately diagnosing a lot of its problems, particularly with things like the problem of computation. But the problem of calculation. So basically, he spent a bunch of his career getting into the epistemology of economics and going like, well, it turns out that if you're a state bureaucrat and you're trying to decide if you should build a road through a mountain, around a mountain, or over a mountain, the market function that sits there to basically integrate asymmetric information of all types so that you can actually make some kind of decision in a rational way isn't there for you to do that. And he's actually correct about that, but it turns out that all of his critiques also apply to capitalist firms. So that's why I said it's very funny, because a lot of the ANCAPs, will sit there and be like, yeah, Hayek's problem, calculation, socialism is wrong. And you're like, absolutely, you're 100% right. Show me how that doesn't apply to a capitalist firm with hierarchies that is not interested in actual objective data and has all of these information and decision-making mechanisms tied up inextricably with hierarchical social games.
Oh, okay, well, I think what I was getting at is like, how about we weave this into the idea that going to work every day, doing something you don't want to do, having no purpose, or thinking that what you're doing has no, it's not going to affect any kind of outcome in any way. I feel like that ties in to your work on serotonin, something Georgi is very familiar with. But I'll actually put up your article on the screen right now. But it was, and then everybody should go just to your website and read this. But Against Utopia, issue 6. The epistemology of depression, part 6. What does a realistic theory of depression look like? So I guess you touched on it in this, but how, like serotonin being kind of this dreary hibernation like hormone, and that probably playing into a lot of society's issues. If there's a group of people all having high serotonin, that doesn't really speak that well for society in general.
Yeah, it kind of depends on which way you come at it from, but like let's take it from where you were talking about it. So like if you start with
That's actually better, Georgie. Just keep that.
Okay. All right.
if you start with like if you go back to what Ray's email said about meaning structures, right? Like one of the I didn't really know what he was talking about at the time, but I thought about it some more, and I kind of get what he's getting at after I talked about it with a few of my friends. But what he means by meaning structures are, as I talked to him a bit about this later as well, is like the sort of traditional meaning structures are things like, let's say up until the Enlightenment, were things like, rule by kings, the church, the family and the communal life. Like there are various things that are constraints on meaning, right? They provide meaning within certain avenues of life. And if you think about like modernity, right? Like when you had modern structures of meaning, like bureaucracies come into play. And then around 1800 or around 1700 or so, you had like the creation of firms. And these are like new meaning structures where they're literally saying the meaning does not come from king, nor does it come from God. It comes from something called rationality, right? And what's rational is things that are, e.g. double ledger bookkeeping and the things that we're doing to make sure that we're making, profit and other things go up and to the right. So like when you talk about meaning structures in that regard, people are like, oh, great. So like profit and loss, that's a really good meaning structure. It usually determines what actions you should take. It tells you how to orient yourself. And that's typically true, actually. The problem is that, when you start to get into certain sectors of the economy make this really obvious. So, stick with me here. I'm going to talk about Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber, which is a great book. But anyway, there's an economist called William Baumol who found evidence for something called Baumel's cost disease, and he calls it cost disease because people don't know what the cause of it is. And in a few sectors he talks about childcare, education, healthcare, and a few more that I'm not recalling right now. But what ends up happening over time is that we have things like the cost of TVs and computers and everything just massively exponentially going down. The costs in these service sectors are meanwhile doing the exact opposite in most Western economies. Why is that? Well, Baumol doesn't really know, but at the time he didn't. I actually don't know if he's still alive, but for the most part, we figured it out at least in a couple areas. In healthcare, it's very obvious, and America is the best case of this. In healthcare, the problem is administrative, right? Like there has been a profound institutional and personal incentive to add as many possible administrators as you can in order for the firm to bill as much as it possibly can in order to pad its revenues. I'm not interested in even making a case for the other side of this. It just means you haven't even looked at the P&Ls of insurance companies or worked at healthcare like I have. So, but the point being that there's a profound institutional inefficiency and an incentive to keep that inefficiency going by hiring, duct tapers, fixers of any kind who can actually keep something in fucking development hell forever so that they can bill as much as possible for it. And then to hire armies of people to go, how can you bill more for this? How can you bill the government more for this? How can you bill the private insurance more for this? People like to point at the government and say that they're the originator of this problem, but I'll show you any number of public sector economies that don't actually suffer from this problem. Point being that profound institutional incentive also creates a huge drive to hire hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who have just absolutely meaningless jobs. And there's a great book on this called Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber, where he actually does like an ethnography of these jobs and tries to show, he first tries to define why they're bullshit jobs. And he does it with the people themselves. He's not trying to be mean about it. He's not trying to say those people have bullshit jobs and they should be eliminated. It's like, actually, do they think their jobs are bullshit? Turns out most of the time, yes, they do. So then you go back to the stuff we're talking about here, and it's like, what is the effect on your psychology and on your physiology when every day you wake up and you have been enclosed on your life has been enclosed by debt or by some other thing that you have to do, and the only way out of it is by having a job that you yourself know is meaningless, right? Like that's pretty shitty, based on a lot of the stuff that we were talking about. So in the newsletter, I talk about And actually, shout out to Georgi for this. He helped me with something like 30 to 40% of it, because I had done a lot of older research, and he popped in there with stuff on ketamine and cortisol and a bunch of other stuff that was super helpful. But then towards the end of all that, I get into there's this guy in Hamilton at the he's in Hamilton, Canada, McMaster University, Paul Andrews. He's done a lot of work writing good reviews on the impact of various behaviors, so things that people do and the effect of these things and their correlation with depressive states. And one of those things is rumination. So I get into the like really deep sort of reviews of what happens to a brain when it's ruminating, what type of energy, what is the energy mix that it's using, how much of it is glycolysis, what happens to the glycolytic products in the brain, how does the brain actually respond. And the coolest one I think from this was that basically Paul Andrews dug up a review, in his review he dug up a thing where you could basically show very obviously that the higher the correlation between the amount of serotonin glycolysis there is, sorry, let me back up, I'm mixing things up here. The more serotonin there is in your brain, the more glycolysis there is, and the higher you score on the Hamilton Depression Research Scale. So what that means is, I'm making a really broad point here that is mostly speculation. No one has sat there and said, let me design a study that takes people who have self-reported that they're in bullshit jobs, who score X on a scale of meaninglessness relative to that. Let me put them in an fMRI. Let me look at the correlation between the various oxygen and fluoride PET signals, and let me then look at the Hamilton Depression Scale and how they score. The study doesn't exist. All I'm saying is that the pieces are kind of out there, right? So something to think about if you're in a meaningless job.
Well, I thought this article was a tour de force. I thought it was really great. And one of the things I didn't actually know, like a mechanism is Georgia, you probably know this too, but what receptor was it from serotonin that more powerfully increased ECTH than CRH, the corticotropin release?
It's the 5-HT2C, so 2C. So basically anything that acts as an agonist will powerfully activate the adrenal axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. Even if you suppress CRH, basically the effect will still be your adrenals will go into an overdrive. And by the way, that receptor also is known to suppress thyroid function directly. So you get like basically you hit two birds with one stone in a really bad way. You activate the adrenals and you turn off the thyroid. And the effects, serotonin has a known effect that most doctors would not deny, that serotonin and lactate are very highly correlated, especially in the brain. And as soon as your lactate levels rise, higher level cognitive function declines. And you can actually sense this. You can do some experiments whenever you feel like you're ruminating too much. And many people probably they have a continuous movement across to the Hamilton Depression Scale throughout the day, depending on their experiences. Whenever you feel like you're starting to ruminate too much, try just taking a little bit of thiamine or methylene blue, and you'll see how immediately your inner brain thoughts will stop, or at the very least you'll get out of that excessively verbal pattern where you basically one thought leads to another. I think Ray mentioned it, that he had a similar experience where he had high fever. So he basically had nightmares, and these nightmares didn't really have any images. It was just words, a bunch of words, one leading to the other and the other, and so on and so on. And basically to Ray, there was a sign, a great sign that brain metabolism is not working well. Schizophrenics actually tend to have the same things. Like this is a sign of psychosis, and schizophrenia is a type of psychosis.
Well, speaking of, Georgia, you posted an article on your website, hateit.me. It said, if current trends hold within a decade, the entire population may become autistic. And I know you've written a lot about serotonin having a connection with autism.
Yeah, and the strange thing, though, is that if you look at this article, the person who wrote it, the study that was behind it, basically they said, that's because our definition of autism is becoming more and more blurred, right? Mm-hmm. But how about the other way around? How about the population in general is getting less and less healthy? And by less and less healthy, I mean across the spectrum. Of course, doctors will say, well, every disease is isolated, right? If you have a cardiovascular disease, that doesn't mean you have a brain disease, but that's not true. I mean, if you look at the underlying metabolics and energetics, almost every problem should be looked at as systemic unless there is serious evidence to the contrary. And if we have these multiple studies coming out saying that people that are in their 20s have the same health problems and essentially on average the same biological age as people who are chronologically at the age of 50, then I think the much more likely explanation is no, it's not that the definition of autism is becoming more blurred, it's everybody is becoming autistic.
So it's this thing you said about language and rumination in the brain too. I think I never shared this one with anybody, so I should just actually throw this out here. You're probably gonna like this. So I sent Ray an email about a year and a half ago, and this goes exactly to Georgie's point. I had read this book called Metaphors We Live By George Lakoff, right? And what he was doing was he's a cognitive scientist and philosopher, and he wrote the book to basically say that with a simple example of speech, that in English, intonations upward indicate the unknown, as in we think that unknown is up, and the intonations downward in inflection indicate known things. So known is down, is the metaphor that our brains operate by. But then he kind of says that the regularities of these linguistic forms can't be explained by formal rules alone, right? Like Chomsky type stuff. You know how like Pete's always shitting on Chomsky, which is funny. But then he kind of says, then I was like, well, only these regularities only make sense when they're seen in terms of the application of conceptual metaphors to our spatial conceptualization of linguistic forms. So being, right? Like they only make sense if we're embodied, if we're in a body. And we have references, right? So the logic of language is based on the coherences between the spatialized form and the conceptual system. And so to me, I was like, it sounds like this is explicitly aligned against the type of being that Chomsky puts forth, that it's genetic and modeled in the genes. And then I was like, how do you think this comports with the view of P.K., Anokin, Pavlov, and other Russians who expounded on similar theories? Is embodied cognition just a Western reconceptualization of their work? And then this is like where the shit gets interesting, because I was like, oh, you probably won't respond to this. He responded in like 2 hours. And he was like, I think Chomsky's usefulness has been to concretize the trend toward an unpleasant emptiness of the Judeo-Christian philosophical tradition into his description of what he calls language. And then he goes, in 1959, I saw a notice on a bulletin board that Ohio State had begun a new interdepartmental graduate program in linguistics and decided to be a good way to continue my interest in philosophy, language, and psychology. So when the head of the linguistics committee, Morton Bloomfield, heard my interest, he let me enroll but suggested I might be happier studying at MIT with Chomsky. In the course I taught at Urbana, two main themes were Norbert Wiener's cybernetic approach to biology and the interactions of radiation with matter. And in that area, I consider the meaning of digitization and quantization and the implications of alternative approaches, right? And so this is where it gets interesting. Is he goes, the ideology of digitization and computability has an analog relationship to Western culture. They are aspects of the same thing. If that fact isn't incorporated into the process of understanding, the resulting understanding is susceptible to being misled by the quantizing ideology. When people like Husserl do phenomenology, which Edmund Husserl, this YouTube live stream is not long enough for us to talk about Edmund Husserl. They find their own essentialist style of perceiving, and they think they're knowing something about being. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. He goes, meaning consciousness is one of the analog processes of nature. Chomsky, Pavlov, and Anokin lived to some extent outside the essentialist culture. I think that Orthodox theology made it easier to avoid abstract ideas of cognition. So basically, if you think back to what Georgi was saying about these ruminative ideas and thinking in words instead of words and numbers and all that instead of pictures, he's basically saying that, like, relative to this, that is almost an artifact of coming up in this kind of culture where everything is digitized and computable. And so then you run with Georgie's other thing about how in a generation are we all going to be autistic? It's an interesting hypothetical, I think.
I don't fully understand this, but I talked to him not too long ago, and we did get on the topic of philosophy and his field theory and William James and things like that. But he was trying to make a point to me that I think I'm not smart enough to understand, but he was talking about language and the only thing really being communicated being matter and forms. And I was like, right, is the language on top of that? And I think he was maybe just appeasing me because I wasn't fully understanding him. But what we're talking about is language is kind of a way to atomize the thinking, and that's like it's kind of like a form of it's not a conspiracy, but like a form of control, right?
Yeah, you're not the first person to say this. I was talking to someone because I'm going to interview James C. Scott, who's a political scientist and has written probably like one of the most formative books I've ever read called Seeing Like a State, where he kind of talks about how states actually form their various levers of social control, where those came from and how they work. But what was really interesting is Scott wrote a book called Against the Grain, which is about it's a retelling. It's like a New York Times bestseller, whatever, all that shit. But the point is, it's a retelling of of this sort of historical materialist view of, we were hunter-gatherers, and then we became farmers, and then the farms got big, and we became, states and whatever, right? It's actually incorporating a lot of the new sort of archaeological and anthropological data from the last 20 years. And one of the key parts of that book is really interesting. He talks about language, and he talks about how instead of us getting language in Sumeria, in 3000 BC to keep track of, the fucking grain stores, we got and lost language many, many times. And there's much evidence for people who realizing that language is being used to control them and revolting. So there's like hundreds of groups throughout the world who have, those groups, some of them are not around anymore. They're getting scarce and more and more scarce. But the point is, they have like fables where they got rid of someone who had numerals, and they all have the numerals still, but they don't know what they mean. And he talks about them in Cambodia, Laos, parts of Africa, all kinds of that, right? And the one he actually gets to eventually is Greek, which is super interesting. In 1300 BC was the dark age of Greece. They lost writing, and Greek writing apparently came back only with Phoenician script like 900 years later. And then people were thinking like, well, what happened? Why did this happen? And his theory, which is kind of speculative, is that there were revolts against people using language for social control. And whereas, we might look at even the Dark Ages of Europe as, the Dark Ages, we lost art and culture and this and that. It may have been more free than you or I know, actually. Like, that might have been the trade-off.
Couple of things. Who was the guy who said that language is by and large a tool for concealing the truth? I'm sure you've heard that expression.
I've heard it. I don't know who the author was.
Either George Carlin or Jerry Rubin, who was like a civil rights activist in the 60s. He said that, and the second thing is like never trust anybody over 30. These two things stuck with me.
That is George Carlin, by the way.
Yeah, I think that's George Carlin. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so speaking of basically excessive verbalism and conformity, studies have been done on humans in mental institutions, and of course these studies were unethical, but they were done anyway. So now we know the results. They found out you can reliably trigger psychosis even in healthy people by locking them up in a room that's completely white, and it basically limits their sensory perception of the world. So what happened, and they measure, and basically these people, the first thing that happens within 24 hours is these people start hallucinating, and they start hallucinating extremely vividly with images. But if you don't provide, basically if this isolation continues, by the third day, the dreams change from very vivid images to almost entirely verbal, and they basically become temporarily, at the very least, because the studies didn't. I mean, they lasted for a fixed number of time, for a fixed number of days. These people became temporarily psychotic, and they had the exact same patterns of this excessive verbalization that is so characteristic of schizophrenia, of mania, of bipolar disorder, etc., etc. So whenever you remove basically the ability of the organism to place itself in a three-dimensional environment that is rich and continuously changing, the primitive, I actually call in my opinion, the verbal system of the brain is actually primitive. So you switch back to recreating your own reality in the absence of sensory information, and language is the only other tool you have, right? In the absence of an outside world, the only thing you have is your inside one, and that one is, if you let it take over, is to rule almost entirely by words.
I know you're saying the control of language goes really, really far back, but I feel like the first time I thought something was up was the Bush era news cycle. Because I swear that was like the first time I became aware of like buzzwords that would be used on the news, and then they just repeat them over and over again, and then your family starts repeating them over and over, and it's just like, yeah, this is clearly some form of control to think about this specific thing with this catchphrase or buzzword or what have you, and that's just gone like overboard now with the current state of things. It seems like that's really prominent.
I had an English teacher because I was I think I was in 10th or 11th grade when he was elected. I had an English teacher who was kind of snarky and was like, hey, I know y'all read 1984. Let's talk about the doublespeak of the Bush administration. Now, of course, he's like some lefty Democrat or whatever. and I was pretty apolitical. So I was just like, okay. And of course, it doesn't start with George Bush, right? But it just seemed to be maybe that because I was young, it was my formative years. Like I just remember some of that shit. But I think about things like Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns and all that kind of shit. And I'm just like, so what are you trying to say here? Because like it's been long enough now that there are all kinds of postmortems of the Bush administration. I don't mean like punditry. I mean like analyses, right? Like one of the interesting ones I saw recently it's a book called Super Forecasting by Phil Tetlock. And if you don't know anything about him, real quick, he's a professor at Berkeley. He's interested in, or he was at Berkeley when I read about this, but he's interested in forecasting. And if you're forecasting, IARPA wants to talk to you, right? That's the advanced research, the intelligence advanced research projects, right? So he's been getting IARPA money for 40 years to run groups of like everyday, like I just mean like the suburban mom down the street, plus like the quantitative financial analysis board at work in Wall Street, plus like whoever, anyone out in the world to forecast and to refine forecasting and see what actually leads to good forecasting. And so he was doing a postmortem on the Bush administration, which I thought was really funny because of his own blind spots. But I'll get to that later. His overall point was really funny because he was like, well, so the way that it went down, the CIA learned a lot from it because they hadn't really. This goes right to the language point, by the way. It's hilarious. He goes, they hadn't spent the time defining the meaning of things like very likely, not likely, and these other things, right? So internally, when they're having these conversations, they didn't have someone would say something like, well, it's very likely that Al-Qaeda is going to fly a plane in, or something related to planes is going to happen in the next 6 months. That was a real forecast from an IARPA person, right? Yeah,
Rumsfeld and Cheney had worked on I'm going to butcher it so bad, but they had worked on the idea that was going to happen.
Yeah,
that's well known. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Right. But then people were like, well, so why didn't we do anything about it? And then there's all kinds of these theories, right? Where they're like, well, they didn't define very likely or this, that, and the other. And you really see how shitty of a technology language is, right? Like it's right there for you. Like I'm not trying to tell you not to learn how to read or be a mute, right? I'm just saying that there could be other advances beyond what we currently have because we use this tool as a way to convey shared understandings of the world, and it's pretty shitty at doing that. Right? Another good example, which he got into, was he was analyzing the Obama administration and them going after Osama bin Laden, and he was shitting on Obama because Obama was like, Obama heard a bunch of stuff about where Osama bin Laden is, and there's like a 6'11" guy in Abbottabad, in some place in Pakistan. And by this point, 10 years on, the CIA's sort of like meaning structures and linguistic, shared understanding had progressed. So someone had put in a report that said it was very likely that this person is Osama bin Laden, and that if we actually sent a SEAL team plus whoever else was in there, I don't know the specifics, to take him out, there's a high likelihood that that will be a successful thing. And he goes, okay, what does that mean? And someone goes, well, by our calibration, these things mean 70% that Osama bin Laden is there, and something more like 60% that we can pull this off. And so Obama hears that and goes, what I'm hearing is that it's 50-50. It's a pretty funny story. I recommend it only because like Tetlock's politics are hilariously normie, but like the work is good. Like you will learn how to make better predictions for sure. And if you participate in his the Good Judgment Project, I think it's called, GJP, he runs it. It's ongoing all the time. So it's an interesting way to see like the intersection of digitization, quantization, and math with this other sort of like, propositional thing of trying to predict things in the future. It's incredibly difficult.
I feel like this would never happen today, but do you remember it was, I forgot what news organization it was, but Rumsfeld is on the news organization, and it's kind of into bombing Iraq, and it's like far into that. And one of the news people, it's like on MSNBC or something, it's something big. Yeah. And the guy is like saying that Rumsfeld said it was 9/11 was because linked with Iraq, and then Rumsfeld says like, no, I never said that. And then they read off a transcript where he did say it. And again, I honestly don't think something like that would happen today. But Rumsfeld and Cheney are like such big pieces of shit. Like I can't believe. Maybe people are just forgetting, but it's like, and I know all politicians are like, I don't think you can rise to the top unless you're a pretty horrible person, but again, like,
there are no good politicians.
Yeah. But I consider that when I compare politicians, they seem like some true evil. like Cheney has that quote of one of the reporters is saying like 80% of America doesn't want to go to Iraq or some ridiculously high number, and Cheney's just like, so what? Like, couldn't give a shit.
Well, yeah, like even though we came here, whatever. Sorry to make your YouTube live stream super political, but what I admire about those pieces of shit is that they at least know how power works, right? Mm-hmm. Like he's literally sitting there, someone's going like, hey, 80% of America doesn't think you should do this, and he's like, yeah, what's your point?
Like, we got elected, right? We got all the power that we need.
Yeah. That's one thing you can always say about Republicans is they understand how fucking power works. Like it's like whereas it seems like Democrats are always running away from it. They're just like, we have a majority in both houses. We can pass public health care option, but we should be reasonable. We should negotiate with ourselves down to something reasonable.
But I just want to. I don't care what we talk about politics or whatever. But I am interested. What is your potential solution to that? Because I mean, Ray's talked about debranding some of these big, and also Georgia, you too. But like debranding some of the like. What were the three things he said that if you got rid of, society would be a little bit better? Like education, medicine, and law.
It was probably intellectual property. This is probably one of those. Like getting rid of IP.
But what I was asking about earlier, like in your idealized society, people are autonomous and they're doing what they want to do. And you have a specific point of view on that, right?
Not really, because I think it's really hard to have a specific point of view on that. Mm-hmm. I don't really have an ideal society, and I think you can predict it from the title of my website, which is Against Utopia.
Can you explain that more? I am interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that where the Serotonin Depression Project even came from is that my entire position is that the sort of rationalist structures of sort of like liberal government plus medical trades and regulatory bodies coupled with the sort of pharmaceutical capitalist machine have their own incentives. And we shouldn't be surprised by what we're seeing, because there isn't really a free market in medicine, right? And so, but as a result of that, given their incentives filter through down to the level of the epistemology of the things they're working on. So what does that mean? It means that the way that they derive knowledge about human bodies is specifically geared toward things that they can shape and study in randomized controlled studies. It does not mean that physiology necessarily is that way, right? And I'm not even going to address like the being in the world part of this, because that would get us into some weird philosophical conversation about realism and all that, and I don't want to talk about that. But what I will say is why I chose Against Utopia as a name, which I'm not even married to that name, but the reason I chose it is because I think that that's a utopian view of human biology, to be able to say things like, this receptor right here appears to be responsible for all of depression. That's a like very utopian view, right? Like, and if you it is only that way because you shaped the various mechanisms that are under your control to spit that out as the answer, and then you're working backwards from that answer to say, if we find a bunch of compounds that influence it, maybe we'll influence depression, right? But like the whole exercise is kind of hilarious. Like, I think Alzheimer's disease is a very good example of it. There is no good Alzheimer's drug, basically, and and almost all the drugs have been colossal failures. Why? Well, the way that we know Alzheimer's disease, the epistemology of Alzheimer's disease, is one that's built on an ontology of 7 stages, seven stages of disease, right? These stages exist in our minds. They don't exist in your body. But they help us, but we make them up because they help us understand the disease and its progression so that we can talk about how bad it is or what stage you're in, right? The problem is when you take this staging and you treat it as a monolith and say that it's real, and then design studies to prevent progression along that staging. You shouldn't be surprised that no drug works because stages aren't real. Right? Like what I'm referring to is these things are called surrogate endpoints of studies, right? So a surrogate endpoint for a given randomized controlled trial could be something like prevent progression from stage 3 to stage 2. And we think that stage 3 and stage 2 are influenced by so-and-so state of tau protein in the brain, and then they work backward from that sort of idea and say, here are compounds we think that will influence that. Why do they never work on stage 7 or stage 6, does anyone ask? Georgi, do you know why?
I think the problem goes back to the point you made about using language. The more atomic you make a disease, the more you break it down into stages, the more reductionist the approach is, then the less likely it is that you're going to find a single compound that works. It all comes down to bureaucratizing the condition so that you basically can throw as many people as you can. Just as you said, there is a tremendous incentive to put as many people as you can in bill. And that applies not just to hospitals, it actually applies to clinical trials, and it applies to basic research as well, because most of the basic research in this country, and many people don't know that, is not funded by pharmaceutical companies. It's funded by the federal government, by taxpayers' dollars. So if you're running a lab anywhere, whether that's a government lab or a private lab, you have the incentive of saying you have 100 PhDs working on as many different stages as you can break it down into. And then basically you are funded for life. I mean, you're going to keep applying for grants and over and over and over again. And the only thing this gets down to is you continue adding more phases to the disease and publishing more papers. But if you look at the actual total amount of knowledge, it doesn't increase. You actually know less about the disease.
Totally. I really liked what the term you used there, bureaucratizing. Just think about the effect of any bureaucracy on the understanding of what the bureaucracy actually does, right? Like a great example is when you ask a person how a company works, some explanations are usually stuff like, well, there's the org chart, right? Like that's how it works. And it's like, that contains 0 content about what it actually does, right? But it's an easy story to tell. It's very easy to be like, oh yeah, this is what it is, right? It's that thing's connected to the other thing and all that. But I want to say yes, and in addition to all that, the argument I'm also making is that no one does stage 6 to 7 because there aren't too many stage 7 to 6 people. There are way more people who are at risk of stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. The markets are orders of magnitude bigger because you can point to, instead of a embodied physiological state, you can point to a risk. And then you can justify the risk by saying, look at these other trials we did that say that you fall in this risk bracket, right?
Sorry, finish your thought. Sorry.
But that's kind of the whole thing, right? So like, it shouldn't surprise any of us that the overall drive is to find some way to objectify the disease, then put that disease into the surrogate endpoint sort of ideology, and then design studies that prevent progression, focusing specifically on the parts of it that affect the biggest possible market. It's not because people are trying to help the most people, it's that it actually just ends up that way. And I don't even necessarily think that's evil, by the way. Like, I'm not even saying it's bad. Like, I think it's totally fine to operate by those mechanisms. I just think it should be obvious. That way you can explain the failures of the system very easily, right? Like, it's not necessary that any of these people are evil. They're just operating under the incentives that are in front of them.
Did you guys catch that?
One
Neil?
more thing that happened over the last 30 years related to disease. I don't know how many people have noticed, but medicine moved away from talking about treating a disease towards treating a risk.
Yes.
So, and then basically, like, you never even hear your doctor telling you about, like, oh, if you take this pill, you will not have a heart attack or you will not have a stroke. They'll say, oh, it's all about statistics and risks. It's going to lower your risk for you that you may have a risk, a genetic risk for you to may have a stroke at some point later in your life. So it basically abstracts, it verbalizes the condition, and then with words, anything is possible. If you put a good lawyer could probably argue just about anything in court. First that black is white, and then that white is black, because with words you can achieve anything. And that's exactly where the pharmaceutical industry wants to be, because you can never prove that they failed. They can always come up with a study which says, look, we did reduce the risk of going from stage 4 to stage 3. And it's impossible to disprove it, because in Karl Popper's words, it's not really a falsifiable idea. Like, how do you prove that this drug failed? They can come up with their own measure of risk, right? And since they're the ones defining the quantification of risk, you as a person or even as a lab, you can never prove them wrong. And they will keep getting funded.
And because this is a social process, and it's not a process that is, objective, or I'm not necessarily even saying it should be, but it is a social process. It means that it can be hijacked by the people who run it in favor of the metrics they want to turn it to, right? Like, and you shouldn't be surprised to see that happen, right? Like, if what I said wasn't true, here's a great example, right? There was something, I believe it was published in The Lancet, but there was this really great graph where they basically show that they show the efficacy of drugs before pre-registration, right? So, like, you basically looks like, if you're looking at the axes, like, like half of the drugs are doing really well, right? And then they make them pre-register all their variables beforehand and not change any of them. And suddenly after that pre-registration, all of them gone. Yeah. Like, you shouldn't be surprised, right? It's not evil. It's just that a bunch of people said, well, of course we would do that. Like Dick Cheney, right? Like, why wouldn't we do that?
That's why we got elected. That's why we got elected.
Why do I have the relationships with the FDA that I do if I wouldn't do this? Like, are you crazy?
Can I play this 48-second Neil deGrasse Tyson thing that I posted on my Twitter? Because I honestly feel like it actually speaks to a lot of the things we're talking about, from science not like being this scroll that has certain things said on that can never change, and also speaks to, I think, controlling language. And so you guys won't be able to see this, but hopefully you can hear it.
But what I'm saying is, not everyone embraces everything that science does, and some will cherry pick it. You have the science deniers for global warming. You have science deniers with vaccines. You have science deniers with GMOs. There's all manner of science denying going on in modern society, and we in a free society, what are you going to do, right? The people can think what they want, but if thinking what they want influences policy, which then affects everybody, then your science denial has consequences to the economic health of the nation. And by the way, it's not only economics, it's the economic health, it's your physical health. That flows through advances in science, as well as our
this is such garbage.
I literally have watched this like 10 times, and I feel like physically ill when I watch it, because he's making so many errors, and like his error is like his basic presupposition that, like you said, like in your article, there are no correct models. And that's what he's basically saying, that what science says is correct, and that if you are a science denier, speaking of controlling people with language, which I've actually heard people say that, then you are ruining society. You
know where this is going, right? It's the same idea of the preemptive strike. It's basically like, if you're this country half the world away. Yeah. But if I determine that your actions are interfering with my national security policy and hurting my people,
my national medical policy,
exactly.
Yeah, it really makes you think about a public option in the hands of these fucking ghouls, right? Like, oh man, like I bet you Americans will find a uniquely shitty way to enact that. Well, they'll just be like, wait a minute, our fucking chronometer detector detected that you entered Lay's potato chips into your shit. Your premiums just went up, right? Crazy shit like that. The other part of it that disgusts me as an anarchist is all the bullshit nationalism. Can you believe how much you have to hate individual humans in order to say things like national well-being or physical health and economic health of the nation? How much contempt you must have for individualism and individuals to have an idea like that in your brain. It's fucking disgusting.
You hit it on the head. That's what that clip speaks to, his total contempt for people that don't think the way he does. Like,
disgusting.
Yeah, it's pretty gross. And then he was also saying that by basically a person avoiding a vaccine is going to pay for it health-wise, and they're just ruining society. And I'm not trying to make a point about any of those specific things that he said, but just the idea that if you don't agree with what I'm assuming just mainstream science, you're going to ruin society. It's so absurd.
But he's also making the argument that you're not only going to ruin your health, you're going to ruin his as well.
Yeah.
And I think he's preparing the following stage of the argument is, well, guess what? We're going to stop you from hurting us by thinking for yourself. And we're going to come up with a bunch of different ways. And actually, Google and Palantir, they have software already. I also know people who work in Palantir. They're now analyzing, if you sit at a corporation that has anything more than, let's say, 200 people, because only these companies can afford the software, but I'm sure Palantir will find a way to drop the price and install it everywhere. They're analyzing the way you email your coworkers. And now they're basically starting to come up with a score of how likely you are to revolt against proper authority. And it starts with revolting against the corporate proper authority, but there's no barrier to implement this at the national level as well. And I'm pretty sure something like this probably already exists. Like, are you against the U.S. government? Are you against against the rightful power, et cetera, et cetera? But Palantir is now basically apparently working on something that is specifically targeted to people who espouse anti-scientific ideas.
Nice.
And the pilot project was apparently done on anti-vax. And some of the people who work at Palantir resigned because I have to send you the article. I think it was in the Washington Post, which, even though it's a horrible media, every once in a while it gets leaks, which are kind of interesting. So they basically said that a bunch of people who were working on software at Palantir resigned because they said Palantir trained the model to basically kind of weed out people who are capable of questioning others. So the only people who are approved by the model is basically if you're as conformist as possible. And that starts with a health topic, but the model can be trained on just about anything, right? I mean, you start vax, then it's climate change, then it's basically the wars that a nation may launch, right? Are you with them or against them, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. For us or against us?
There's no end in sight. Yeah, exactly. There's no end in sight.
Yeah, man. That's there was a lot in there actually, but the contempt side of it. I actually forgot what I was going to say. I'm sorry.
No problem. It's late.
Oh, no, we'll come back to it, man.
Shoot, sure. I just forgot what I was going to say. Go, Georgie.
Me? I actually have an idea of how to fight this a little bit. I think excessive verbalism is at the core because language is such a powerful tool for controlling society, for controlling individuals really, and actually having an anti-individualism effect. How about changing the school system to have one day, just like Ray does, where you don't speak? Like, you basically, whatever activities you do, I mean, you can, obviously kids will chat with each other every once in a while, but you can limit the amount of time spent in the classroom, because classrooms to this day remain almost predominantly verbal environments, like environments that are essentially bestowing knowledge or bestowing information upon these impressionable young minds. So have one day, just like Google used to do, 20% of your time you work on any project you want. Well, how about 20% of school time to be kids doing anything they want except talk or except listen to the teacher? This could get out of hand, but I think you see my point. And I think we can do this with adults as well. How about having a news media that does that basically reports the news entirely in image. No words, no comment. I mean, you can have commentary. You can have the commentary turned on if you want individually, but have the basic news media be nothing but video. And you'll be surprised how differently people will view events if you don't actually have this voice there saying, "Oh, we're seeing the two planes hitting the Twin Towers." Germany and Italy actually had a social experiment, which was quickly killed as soon as the United States heard of it. Basically, where they had people watch the videos of the planes hitting the towers, and then they asked people to kind of write down what is it that they saw. I mean, between 50 people who saw those videos, but without any commentary, you'll be amazed at how diverse the views were. And about 30% basically said that they didn't see any planes. And I'm not saying that I don't.
Right. I have heard of this. That's right. Yeah, I remember this.
I don't want the viewers to think that I'm pushing the conspiracy theory. I'm just trying to give you an example that if you remove the voice of authority, people will start little by little to think for themselves, and to, even if it's a crazy idea at the beginning, they will report what they actually see, right? And it will take a little bit of time to get detrained to report what you've been told to report. But I think it's a very powerful force for individualism and for anti-authoritarianism, by making people consciously avoid being subjected to the verbal dictatorship that is all around us.
I remember what I was going to say. When I got on the phone with Ray, I was like, Ray, did you hear that conspiracy theorists are now a domestic terror threat? And he goes, yeah, I heard that.
And also I'd be surprised that it took this long.
Oh yeah. Well, I asked him, I was like, is this just the part of turning things up to 11? It's just, again, like he said, the only good part about what is happening now there are many subversives versus when he was thinking that things were corrupt in the 50s or whatever. He said, he made a joke and he said like half a dozen people thought that the going to war was for money, etc. And so that's what he said. Yeah. The good part about things were.
Well, I just reminded what I was going to think. It's like there's a much simpler way to even have a more sort of broader approach to the shit that Neil deGrasse Tyson was talking about. Mm-hmm. Like when you're talking about even anti-vax, I'm not anti-vax. I have a 5-year-old. He's been vaccinated, right? But the point is you are using ideology to what's the term? To pathologize the behavior of other people, where if someone, and basically steal bodily autonomy, literally get rid of the notion of bodily autonomy, that you have any kind of right to what happens to your body. I'm fully vaccinated. My child is too. But if someone I don't really want to go to my local judge and say, hey, she's not fucking vaccinated. You should send the cops after her, because that's where this leads. When you put it in the government's hands, the government is an instrument of violence. It's the only thing it does, right? Yep. So all I'm saying is that perhaps we can find better ways to do that than sending the guys with guns to your house.
True that. Yeah. And just for posterity, your Jahed's views, you have your own views, and I'm not speaking for you, but my crazy conspiracy leniency or anything like that. So I don't want you to get trouble when you run for president in a few years.
I would. Oh, I mean, I can't tell you how I feel about presidents on this, because
I know, totally joking.
I would get a knock on the door.
Okay. Did you guys, anything left with your article, Jahed, that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get into?
Not much. I was going to say, I like what Georgi was saying about, statistics. That's basically half of the series. I spent maybe 12,000 words, probably 3,000 too many, talking about how the primary way that the medical system sees things now is through statistics. And I'm basically stealing, or I maybe building on the work of one Michel Foucault, who he kind of spent a lot of time looking at. There's a great book he wrote called The Birth of a Clinic, where he's talking about how in post-revolutionary France, the system of medical control was kind of put in place. Where did it come from? How did doctors derive medical facts? what were their sort of systems for understanding facts? What was that progression like? He talks about two of them. He talks about categorization, which is like Linnaean classification, which is really big at that time. This is the kind of stuff that Darwin set out to do. That was a theory that he was thinking of, how can I classify all the various animals into taxonomies? Taxonomies were applied to diseases. There are now really, really funny extinct disease, like disease classifications where you're just like, how the shit is that related to this thing? It was because that's just what they did, right? And then he traces the growth of classification into more empiricism, so like clinical empiricism, because people, and this is now funny to even think that this is how this worked, but the first sort of actual clinics came into being, like they weren't there before, and clinical practice became a thing. And so people started doing wild things like using their experience in the clinic and the things they'd seen in the past to say, this thing that I'm seeing is like that other thing. I'm kind of being facetious here, but it really did operate like that. Like this, he's documented this pretty well, right? So you went from things like pure classification based on like a taxonomy of diseases, and you just execute the program based on what you classify it as, to actually it's developing in real time and there's a certain empiricism to it. And then he died before you could kind of look into it any deeper, but what people were trying to do was they were trying to take the dead bodies that they learned from, and they're trying to take those facts and apply them to living humans. And it's hard because you can't look into a living human. In a lot of ways, it's very invasive, right? So the bridging gap between those, I think, is statistics. And that's like in the third essay, that's literally what I say. Like, I pull some quotes from my own experience and then some other like ethnographic data where people are basically like, just if your listeners or anyone, if you've ever been a doctor, how much of the time do they say things like, 50% of the time this operation is a success, but that should be weighed against the costs of surgery, financial, and otherwise. Or these types of cysts generally have a very low likelihood of becoming malignant, therefore not operating is probably the best option, but they can get ugly. So if cosmetic reasons matter to you, the operation is valid. Or 1 in 5 patients experience improved symptoms on, Prozac within 90 days. 1 in 20 experience suicidal thoughts, and 2 out of 5 do not respond. It has low likelihood of working for you because of, whatever, right? Like this sort of language doesn't come out of anywhere, right? It has a conceptual system. It got there to address an actual problem that real existing doctors are trying to address. And you're not even saying that I'm not even necessarily saying this is bad. It's more about how did this come to be and what are the costs and benefits, right?
And just the master of that is Ivan Illich, is critiquing how that system came to be. And I know both of you guys have read him. Oh yeah. He's he's interesting. I actually pulled from him a ton in this series, but like Illich is it's funny as my own views have developed. Like I'm not anti-Illich, but I think like Illich's points of view. Don't disparage Illich, Jahed. This is the only thing I will not tolerate on this live stream.
No, if any of my transhumanist anarchist friends seem not shitting on Illich, they'll be very disappointed. No, my whole thing with Illich is I think the only problem with Illich is that some of his epistemology, like modern doctors, is somewhat backs into eugenics. Like, not that he's a eugenicist, but that is some of the points he makes ends up pointing to things like, we never should have done X because then it allowed X type of person and type of large amount of sickness associated with X type of person to persist. Therefore, this part of the medical system was bad. And, sometimes I reread a lot of Illich with a critical eye. This is like nitpicking, right? Like overall, I think he's right. But there are some things like that where you're like, well, perhaps we can find other better ways than the current system is addressing that particular area you tend to criticize.
I just wanted to add that the verbalization and the statisticalization of science is not limited to medicine. I've posted a few, I made a few posts on physics, chemistry, like cosmology. I mean, if you look at it, and I think quantum physics is probably the best example. Quantum physics as a discipline is almost entirely statistical. They do run experiments, but most of what they do is actually calculations and simulations with computers. So, and this started, I think Ray said this whole thing started with the atomist model with what's his name, Democritus, like the Greek philosopher. But at this point, I think scientists, because it's a career, they've realized that the approach of that the medical industry does, which is move away from experiments and towards statistics and verbalism, where you can define whatever you want, they've embraced it wholeheartedly. There have been a number of recent articles, even in mainstream media like Scientific American, and they basically said science is stagnant. They remember, like we discussed this in
I remember that.
shows. Yeah, so basically some particle physicists, some people who deal with electromagnetism, they're saying, what is going on? Like we haven't made any new discoveries in 100 years. All we're getting is the latest and greatest new model from a guy who's never left his office. Like, how can this be? How can this be empirical science? How can this be a science about reality if it's all like based on deductions from a model which is based on an assumption? I mean, this physics used to be the queen of empirical sciences, and now it's the queen of the mathematical sciences. So it's not just limited to medicine. I think society in general, which goes back to that recent study that maybe society is becoming autistic precisely because every aspect of its existence, especially the basic sciences, are becoming verbalized. They're bureaucratized and removed from reality.
I don't know the larger context to this quote, but it's that Tesla quote where he says, "Today scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality." But that actually reminds me what you just said, Georgi, of that Paul Andrews quote where he specifically addresses like a lower type of thinking with the melancholic, like serotonergic state, and where he elegantly put it, but I don't remember exactly what he was talking about.
If you talk to a physicist, basically they will try, most of them, I have some friends who work at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, almost all of them mathematicians. I mean, they're physicists on paper, but when it comes to experiments, many of them shy away from experiments. And when I asked them why, they said, reality is kind of messy. It tends to generate paradoxes, but mathematics is simple. We can always introduce a new variable or remove an extra variable. We can always make the model work. But experiment is messy. It tends to falsify most of what we've worked on over the last 10 years.
I got the quote here. This is a paraphrase, but he says the melancholic brain appears to be reconfiguring to learn solutions to complex problems. Learning appears to be so energetically expensive that growth and reproduction are downregulated. The processes involved in making these trade-offs are coordinated by serotonin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in that one too, he was talking about like the various phenotypes of depression. And so the growth and reproduction ones, like he's specifically trying to draw the line to the fact that there is like sexual depression from literally having too much sex. And then there's like from in certain depressive states, you are not able to actually eat enough in order to grow and support those processes. Mm-hmm. So like he's literally saying, and then rumination is doing the same thing, right? Like that's kind of like the line he's drawing.
Just spilled milk on my leg. Jahed, I know you have to go at some point, so don't be shy. And then we'll run through all your things that you have going on.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, but just let me know.
Yep, will do.
Okay. Okay. What do you guys? Jahed, you had mentioned allopregnenolone in your article specifically as a mechanism from some of the SSRIs, and then Georgi, you have an article about allopregnenolone as a treatment for Alzheimer's. So maybe we can talk about that.
Okay. You want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead, man. It's really, you linked to me to allopregnenolone and stuff. So yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's a really good study for a number of reasons. I'm a little bit afraid also because FDA recently approved allopregnenolone for postpartum depression. So two things will happen out of this, most likely. One, it will open the floodgates to a lot more research into neurosteroids, which I think will be good because we'll find, basically more data will come out in terms of their effects on the brain and systemic health in general. The bad thing is that, the more science that comes out that points to how beneficial these things are, allopregnenolone is already a prescription drug. So technically you can get in trouble for selling it or buying it without a prescription. But I mean, I've already seen posts on FDA's website where basically they solicit comments from the general public, and people have already pointed out several MDs, which probably work for FDA surreptitiously or for pharma companies. They've already made the call for banning pregnenolone and progesterone cells over the counter. So that's the part that really concerns me, because they're very well aware, because there are studies that show both progesterone and pregnenolone reliably elevate allopregnanolone levels in the brain. So that's the scary part.
Yeah, Ray had like a 300% increase from a dose of progesterone or something. I know we talked about that. Sorry, go ahead.
And then with pregnenolone, there are studies with schizophrenia where they gave people massive doses, like 500 milligrams a day, and they showed that pregnenolone mostly metabolized, at least in those people, it metabolized into progesterone and allopregnanolone. Actually, allopregnanolone more than anything else. And basically, this new study that came out, I like it because it actually states directly that the mechanism of action of allopregnanolone, and they already did an animal pre-study. This study is actually going to be on humans, but the pre-study, they found out that the way allopregnanolone works is it restores the proper brain energetics. This is kind of unique because most of the people who do studies with allopregnanolone, steroids in general, they tend to talk about receptors, right? There is like the GABA receptor. There are actually multiple versions, A, B, and C. There's the estrogen receptor, progesterone receptor, et cetera, et cetera. So most of the studies that I've seen on allopregnanolone talk about receptors, which is still kind of reductionist. But this study actually says, no, we think that the reason allopregnanolone was beneficial is because it stimulated the genesis of new brain cells, which goes against the grain of what we've been told over the last 50 years, that brain cells do not regenerate. Number one. Yeah. And number two, I think this directly points to, and they kind of hint to that in the study as well, and in the article, that Alzheimer's is not a disease of beta amyloid and tau pathology. These are just signs/symptoms. It really is an energetic dysfunction, or like there was a call a few years ago to make Alzheimer's, to reclassify it as diabetes type 3 or 4, or actually brain-specific diabetes. And this study, this article about the study kind of expands on that. It says, yes, but because diabetes is a metabolic/energetic problem, we should start thinking about Alzheimer's as a metabolic and energetic problem, and not in terms of these misfolded proteins that accumulate, because we have evidence that these proteins are actually there for a reason, and actually there's a hint that they may even be beneficial. There's a study which I posted a long time ago on the forum, which showed that injecting animals that have a model of multiple sclerosis with beta amyloid or tau stopped the disease in its tracks. So we're moving, just like cancer, we should move away from the idea that the body is trying to kill you, or at the very least destroy its own brain, and more towards, this may be a suboptimal adaptation in the face of insufficient energetic production. And, that's why I like this article specifically about allopregnanolone. But the scientists there, they don't, they're kind of hinting towards my fear, which is we may see restrictions by the FDA but we see restrictions put on all of the steroids that are precursors to allopregnanolone. So in global ways.
I forgot what paper it was, but it was like singing the virtues of DHEA, and it was like saying it's like anti-obesity, anti-cortisol, like anti-heart. It was just saying like a litany of different things that it was like really beneficial for, like anti-aging basically. And then it ends with, this should not be available for public use.
I think Georgie even posted. I think Georgie posted that one on the repeat for like.
I probably stole it from you, but I thought that was like crazy, so crazy to read, because you're reading this paper and you're like hyped on DHEA, and then it just says something so stupid in it that it's really funny.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so you had some other articles.
Just pick whichever one you you like. Or
new science blooms after star researcher dies, and it quotes. I haven't read the article, but yet the Max Planck quote said, what was it? It was like, you don't win people over because your hypothesis is so compelling. You win people over when
because they die.
Your adversaries die.
Yeah. Basically, that's exactly it. It was like science doesn't change, but with that it changes when old people die. Yeah.
And I think another quote of his is like, "Science advances one obituary at a time."
Yes, that was the one. Yeah.
Something like that, yeah. So I mean, it's always been a bit of a joke, right? In scientific circles, it's kind of like if you subscribe to that theory, you would immediately be labeled as a cynic, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they actually did a study, and that's what the post is about, and it found out that it's true. I mean, basically, apparently, there is always new science that's galvanizing underneath the bedrock of what we're being told is the current reality, right? Remember, the experts are there to define reality for us. But they also apparently suppress a lot of new ideas that are underneath, and they're always there. I mean, it's just the study was basically it found a stunning amount of diversity of ideas underneath this tyranny of one or two stars in a given field, and they found out that once these people died, not only was there a dramatic increase of new ideas, but there is also a dramatic increase in the cross-citation between disciplines. So these people don't just suppress the underlinks underneath them. They also have a very, very suffocating effect across disciplines. So I guess they're also preventing their underlings from from citing other people. And I've seen that in action. Like you go to, I live not far from NIH, and I know people who work in labs there. I mean, the labs there have a very what should I call it? It's a very adversarial relationship. If you work for a specific lab that works on a certain idea, you don't talk to these peons over there. I mean, you don't quote their studies, you don't cite their studies, you don't go have lunch with them, you don't talk to them, and that's not how science is supposed to work. If there's no cross-pollination, ultimately it leads to the same kind of inbreeding intellectual.
I think Neil deGrasse Tyson knows how science works, Georgi.
Well, I was a graduate student in biophysics at the University of Illinois, like 10 years ago, and it was very, very well known that so I study single molecule biophysics, which is just like asinine when I look at the field now. But I mean, a lot of people get professorships and shit out of it, and they publish papers fine. Point is that everyone knew that the hotshots. This is one of the top, if not the top, biophysics program in the country. So everyone knew that if you worked for Tech Jipa or Paul Selvin, who were the two top sort of minds at that time, or Klaus Schulten, that one or two of them have very, very, very opinionated takes on who you should postdoc for, right? Like, and you should be careful about who you ask for recommendation letters for, because if you're going to go work for Steve Block at Stanford, or you're going to go work at someone, or W.E. Murner at Stanford, competing labs, you're probably not going to get a good recommendation letter. And it's funny because, like, on the other end of this, it's not that these informal networks know of each other and have like complete information. Like, it's not like W.E. Murner's and they're going like, if I got a bad recommendation from a Tech Jipa graduate student, maybe I shouldn't trust that. It's not like they think everyone's acting in good faith for the most part, and that's simply not true.
That's not true. Not in my experience.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. I think it's funny to think about like Ray's orientation towards criticizing science is like probably way different than mine. Mine is like, oh, I gotta win this war on YouTube. But Ray's is like so much broader into the things you guys are speaking of like these huge fundamental problems in science in general. And so I think that sometimes I forget about that. Okay.
So actually, I got to jump off now, guys.
Okay, no problem. Let me go through your stuff real fast. So one, you're on Twitter against Utopia. So go follow you there. You have a Patreon. So patreon.com/against Utopia. What do people get for being your patron?
Oh, sure. So first of all, nothing, basically. I don't believe in intellectual property, so I'm not going to give you special shit for subscribing. Everything I ever publish will be free, and will be free and accessible to anyone. This is basically just to sign up and support my production of the newsletter if you want to, and then I'm going to get rid of some of these other tiers, but I used to let people talk to me like once a month for $50. I'm going to stop doing that because it's hard to schedule, and
don't I know it?
It's exhausting. Yeah, totally. And And there is one to send me an email about anything you want at any time, and I will happily respond to you. I'm happy with that one. That'll still be there. Other than that, like I said, you don't get anything. So I'm not doing the best pitch here, but it's also because I don't care on the intellectual property side of it, because people are like, oh, do I get special things? Or are you going to show me? I'm like, no, I'm not actually. And then on the other side of this, which I think you're probably going to
I'm just about to get there. Okay, so you have a GoFundMe project. Please try this at home.
Yeah, so if any of the themes, by the way, also the website is pleasetrythisathome.net. If any of these themes that we've been talking about around autonomy and, sort of being able to chart your own way towards health, without the sort of larger structures of the regulatory bodies and the sort of capitalist structures that incentivize things outside of our control. If any of this stuff is interesting to you, you should check out Please Try This at Home. It's a conference that we're setting up in Pittsburgh on the weekend of September 14th and 15th. A lot of people who are into autonomous medicine will be there. People who are basically trying to do things like open source EpiPens, open source insulin drugs, open source, you name it, basically. Chemists, biologists, biotechnologists, computer scientists, people like me who have a science background but, are just kind of interested in propaganda, like all that kind of stuff. So if any of these themes resonate with you, we've raised about 80% of the funds. The conference is free, and we're keeping it that way. The funds are basically to cover speaking fees, housing for people who are coming, and that kind of stuff, so that we can make sure anyone who wants to come can come. So if you want to support autonomous medicine and being able to support ourselves as sort of these outside of these authoritarian structures, check it out.
Awesome. Is there anything else, Jahed?
I don't think so for now. I wish I had another hour.
Cool, brother. It's my fault. I goofed and couldn't get this set up in time. So infinite thank you to Jahed. Momand, you are amazing. Thank you so much. And really appreciate spicing up this live stream with your intellectual prowess. So thank you. Thanks, man. Always a pleasure talking to both of you. Cool. We'll have to do it again.
Thanks, man.
All right, y'all. Okay. Take it easy. Have a good rest of your stream.
Okay, we will. All right, bye. Okay, so they just automatically switched to you and I. Great. Let me see. Does that look better? I don't know. Okay, Georgi, what do you want to go through some of the other articles?
Yeah. I mean, let me see. Should I load them up too, or do you have?
Well, I can read them through. So testosterone does not, and let me know when you have to go. But testosterone does not impair empathy in men. Vegans and vegetarians have higher risk of stroke. The Lancet, cancer now leading cause of death in developed and rich. And then also factor in, maybe we should get through this fairly quickly because I think we do have a few super chats. Okay. Let's see. You know what? I'm going to pause you. Let me say the winners of the giveaway. You want to give away 4? Is that what you want to do? Yeah. Okay. So the winners are Carol Ailerston. Thank you so much. She wrote a nice comment. Antares also wrote a nice comment. Bevne, Bevnae, also wrote a great comment and has a history of writing great comments. Thank you. And then Frank Nordaby, and he also wrote a nice comment. So thank you guys. You have run a supplement of idealabsdc.com. Go to the main page, pick out whatever you want, and then email me at danny@dannyroddy.com. And then I'll coordinate with Georgi. And we should mention Idealabs DC in general, your boutique supplement company. So check out that. You can follow Georgi at twitter.com/hateit. You can follow me, not really follow, but if you go to, made a new website or a new page on my website. It's dannyroddy.com/resources. And let me just pitch this really quick. But anyways, I wanted to make it more than just a one-to-one coaching kind of thing. But if you scroll down here, I actually put up a Merck Manual 1947 list of low thyroid symptoms. And then also I put tests that I think are useful. So the average pulse rate, temperature, TSH, total cholesterol, prolactin, parathyroid hormone, vitamin D, iron saturation, serum phosphorus, and Aurora C3. There are probably many others, but I just think those are useful. You can download my book, on this page, you can watch the 2-hour series on my thoughts on pattern baldness here. And then I put a steroid chart and my link to my Instagram. So you can check that out. Anything else I'm forgetting, Georgie?
I think you went through all of it. I mean,
I think I also
I guess just go through the articles.
did. Okay, so which one did you have an affinity for any of these?
So I kind of wanted to go over like the vegans and vegetarians have a high risk of stroke because I'm sure you've heard I guess the mantra we're all getting from the nutritionist is, what was the statement? Eat real food, not too much, mostly plants. Who was the guy who said that?
Michael Pollan.
Yeah, Michael Pollan.
Yeah.
So, but I've actually been following the science, and I quoted an article there in the New York Times, which covered two of the largest studies ever done that looked at health outcomes and try to correlate them to the different types of foods that are being eaten. And then these studies were done in the 80s and in the 90s. And actually, they found that eating vegetables, more of them, not only doesn't prevent cancer, but actually for certain amounts of cancer, you have a dramatically higher risk. If you actually, by every quartile, and I think they quantified it by, I think it was basically a cup of vegetables, right? Because usually, like when you get the dietary recommendation, they're like, oh, eat 3 to 5 servings, which usually amounts to cups of vegetables per day. And these older studies found out that vegetables specifically do not prevent cardiovascular disease, do not prevent cancer, and in fact, for certain specific cancers such as colon cancer, ovarian cancer, breast cancer, and most worryingly, probably like the blood cancers like leukemias and lymphomas, you actually had a much higher chance of getting one of those cancers. And this more recent study now adds stroke to the list, right? It basically says that if you're a vegan or vegetarian, they claim you have a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, but a higher risk of stroke. And that's what strikes me as suspect about this study. Because cardiovascular disease and stroke have such a tight correlation, I don't believe the study is entirely honest. I mean, I do believe the findings about a higher risk of stroke, but I also believe that they did something nefarious just to try to get the study to look a little bit good and at least be publishable by saying that the vegetables decrease the risk of cardiovascular disease. I just don't see a way, a biochemical mechanism through which you will get a higher risk of stroke while simultaneously getting a lower risk for cardiovascular disease. They usually go hand in hand. I've never seen a study that found that these are diverging, that they have a negative correlation with each other. So again, I guess the mantra that we're getting from the nutritionists, from the public health policy gurus has a dark side. And that is, at best, you may not be getting any health benefit. And at worst, you may actually be harming your health long term. So, yeah.
Didn't you and I talk about Meatless Mondays maybe one time on the live stream? You tell me, but isn't the vegetarian vegan push like being turned up a little bit? It seems like it.
And I think the reason why this conversation happened is because I've mentioned many times I used to go more often to the National Geographic organic cafeteria. And now they have Meatless Mondays, and it's gotten to the point where you go inside and you cannot even find eggs in the salad bar. So they've gone from banning meat on Monday to basically, of course, removing any kind of a fish, shellfish. They used to have oysters and shrimp.
Oh, wow.
Those are gone. Those are gone now too. And now the Meatless Mondays are actually entirely vegan. Your only source of protein is either legumes, or actually tofu, which is also a type of a legume because it's coming from soy. But basically, if you want to eat protein, tofu is pretty much your only choice. They used to have lentils. Now the lentils are gone too, probably because of cost. I kind of looked at the prices, and it looks like lentils is actually, of all the legumes you can buy, lentils apparently is the most expensive. So clearly this commercial company that's running the cafeteria is going to go with the cheapest thing they can get, and those are the beans and soybeans, right? So those are the Meatless Mondays. And I actually signed. There was a petition in the cafeteria to bring back meat on Mondays, and it was basically this huge list of people who work at the National Geographic asking for the meat to come back, and then you just had to write your name and put your email address, and then that they said that at the end of the month or however long this the survey or the petition went for, you're going to get an email that basically tells you what's the outcome of this. Guess what happened? I got an angry email at the end of the month. Not only did the petition fail, but I guess this was used as a as a gig to collect the emails of all of the meat lovers, and we basically got this huge talking to by the main nutritionist working for the National Geographic. There's a full staff nutritionist working there. She has a PhD in nutrition. And basically, I received an email, at least myself. I haven't talked to the other people, but I'm assuming, because she did a BCC, so I'm assuming she sent it to a large number of people. I basically get 3 pages of essentially stern talking to of how, this is really, we don't know what we're doing. This is the future. And even if we don't care about ourselves, this is what helps the planet. This is what helps, fight climate change and the global warming, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end, basically, there was this huge list of links, and they all pointing to official websites like the FDA, the USDA, the Center for Disease Control, even NIH, and they were all extolling the virtues of meatless diets. So we failed miserably. The meat lovers failed miserably, and the only thing we achieved is we got on a blacklist. And now, basically, the National Geographic knows who amongst its staff are really in favor of meat, which to them means these people are in favor of ruining the planet. So it is spreading. I mean, I'm also starting to see it now. They don't call it Meatless Mondays, but there are two other buffets that are close to the National Geographic, and every once in a while I go to some of them. They're Korean-run buffets, which usually means they used to have a lot of good seafood. Now this is also gone. Mm-hmm. So now the Korean buffets have replaced most of their seafood offerings with various meatless substitutes that are derived from soy. And when I asked, why is this being done, they claim it's because their customers are requesting it, and they're pointing to the meatless burgers being brought into Burger King and McDonald's. Actually, I don't know if McDonald's says that. I think it's just Burger King at this point. But it seems like this is a population-wide push for dumping meat, for dumping animal protein in general, not just meat. Like I said, National Geographic got rid of even of the eggs. So there is nothing of animal nature, of animal origin, at least on the Mondays when you go to that cafeteria. And the rest of the week, you basically get a choice. Usually, if they have a meat at all, it's usually chicken. That's it. So
this stuff got real to me because there was a place I'll go get milk, and they're just a small little tienda that has specialty items. And I think a lot of gringos go there for their comfort hippie foods from the U.S. But the really enthusiastic salesman that sometimes works there, or the worker there, he's like, Danny, I have something that you are going to love. And he brings me over to the freezer, and he's like, we got the Beyond Burger. And I was like, oh, dude, no, that's not for me.
Exactly, yeah.
But I was talking to the other person that works there, and I was like, that Beyond Burger is not going to fly here in Mexico because it's a huge meat-eating culture. And he's like, oh, no, dude, I'd never touch that shit like that. That would never happen. But it was just funny because the fact that found its way to me, I thought was bizarre because I'd only been reading about the Beyond Burger on YouTube and things.
Just imagine what kind of view they have of the gringos if basically they're saying oh, look, these people are so dumb. We can sell them all the shit and keep the good stuff for us, right? So let's just let them eat their sophisticated and refined crap. And we're going to stick to the beef and bistec, whatever they call it, right? Well, they love their beef, from what I understand.
Well, I guarantee you that it was only because of gringos requesting things like that. Because, I mean, I don't think outside the Western influence you would find really barely any vegetarian or vegan anything here. And in fact, there's a grocery store that has a vegan or a vegetarian/vegan cafe, but the woman who's super awesome is from San Francisco, but she's ethnically Spanish and or Mexican, and she's a really great person. But again, I think she lived in San Francisco for a really, really long time. Yeah, it's crazy. Okay.
So wanted to touch upon the cancer now leading cause of death in developed, rich countries, and I put both of these in quotation marks because I mean I'm sure you've seen the other posts we've already. I don't know if we went on them that the young have now become the old, right? This sort of like the same theme. So cardiovascular disease was the leading cause of death in the Western countries. Those are the developed, quote unquote, rich countries that the study is referring to. But over the last 10 years, cancer has been catching up. And I think this is the first study that shows that now cancer actually not only overtook cardiovascular disease, but it now leads it in terms of deaths of 2-1. So this happened this happened in a matter of less than a decade.
Wow.
And they're saying that even though cardiovascular disease remains the leading cause of death for the rest of the world is also quote unquote catching up. Mm-hmm. So if current trends continue, within a decade, cancer will be the leading cause of death worldwide. And the reason I think this is so sad, aside from the sheer lethality of it, is that just the very economic fabric of most Western societies depends on the idea, probably not just the Western, but many societies are based on the idea that, you have these retired old people who have worked all their lives, right? They can't work anymore. And then they depend on some kind of a pension, which ultimately comes down to younger, healthier people working more, and whether they pay, whether they support the older, sicker ones through taxes or through some kind of other contributions, or by absorbing the cost of healthcare by paying basically more like for health insurance. No matter how you phrase it, ultimately it's a little bit of the younger, healthier people helping the older, sicker folks kind of live their golden years in dignity. But now we're getting to the point where there are no younger, healthier people anymore, and now these people kind of rely on the same, because money is so hard to come by for many people in Western societies at this point. We're getting to a situation where now the younger and healthier people are starting to draw resources from that social healthcare system, Medicare, Medicaid, or even the private health insurance. Now they're using it at least as much or even more than the older folks. Well, you can have this system if that continues, that no matter whether you have socialized healthcare or private healthcare, this system is untenable. Ultimately, it all depends on you paying for something that you use very rarely. But if the society has gotten to a point where everybody's sick, then I'm not seeing a way out of this. I mean, this is probably going to lead to a generational clash, which was a famous politician who said that. I'm blanking. Oh, actually, it was Paul Krugman. It was the economist who writes for the New York Times. He said that he sees within less than a decade, he sees basically extreme polarization of society in terms of how people will vote, right? The older, sicker people will vote for increasing taxes on the young and making the young pay more, right? Because the older, sicker people, they want their healthcare benefits. But the young people are saying, you know what? We're not young and healthy anymore, and we need access to that system as much as you do. So guess what? We're going to channel that money that we are paying more towards our needs. And it really, there's no nice way of putting it, but it may lead to these death panels that everybody was so afraid of. They may actually happen at the voter level, right? People who essentially using their votes, they will likely sort of sentence certain layers of society they'll cut them off from medical care. And maybe that will be for good. Maybe the less people have access to the healthcare system, maybe this will improve their health outcome, and then the whole scam of what medicine is all about will become very obvious. Which reminds me of Ray's newsletter, in which he basically quoted how women with breast cancer living in Appalachia used to have the best outcomes in the country up until the early 70s, which is when the Appalachian Regional Commission was created. And the whole goal of this commission was to bring health care to those poor, underrepresented regions. And as soon as that happened, within 5 or 6 years, the women with breast cancer living there started having the same mortality rates as the rest of the country.
I think he had a really similar story about Marin County in California. Like at one point, that was like the most diagnosed cancer in like the whole country. And the least diagnosed cancer was like some poor part of Virginia. And so It was like basically the newer technology, the diagnosis of cancer and the lethality of that was like very high. But I was going to ask you, is in this article, did they talk about the death rate being associated with cancer's treatment versus cardiovascular disease? Because it'd be more perilous to get treated for cancer than it would for cardiovascular disease, right?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, considering how manipulated the statistics are, I think the very reason we have this study is already pretty telling. Because as we've discussed on previous shows, I mean, the way the cancer industry manipulates statistics is to show that actually cancer care is improving, right? That the death rate of cancers is actually falling, right? So let's say if you get any kind of a cancer, but you die from, let's say, cardiotoxicity because of the chemotherapy. Most of the chemotherapeutic drugs have severe kidney and heart toxicity. Then that death will not be counted as cancer related. It will be counted as basically heart failure or whatever. And actually, in some cases, some states have now passed laws which basically prevent the death from being recorded as iatrogenic. To completely shield the medical industry from any kind of blame, because they're saying like, well, look, most cancer treatments span months, if not years. So over that time frame, basically the medical industry is saying, well, we don't know if whether you got the heart failure from the cancer drug. I mean, it could be from a number of different things, poor lifestyle, irresponsible diet, bad genes, right? All of these things, just like as the Erin Brockovich movie, that's what the argument of PG&E originally was. All these people weren't getting cancer from the chromium. It was just these people were living irresponsible lifestyles and they had bad genes. So the same thing now is being applied to the various cancer treatments, including surgery and radiotherapy as well. So just the fact this is in the Lancet, right? I mean, if the Lancet publishes a study which says cancer death rates are actually increasing and now they're overtaking cardiovascular disease, then no matter how you spin it, you can't really, I think somebody should be actually writing to the editors and saying, then how come you guys have been telling us that cancer death rates are falling? How can cancer overtake cardiovascular disease if the cancer death rates are falling? The only way for this to happen is if basically cardiovascular disease rates are basically skyrocketing, right? I mean, there's no other way to explain this. But I'm actually tempted to send an email to the editor who wrote that op-ed in the Lancet about the study. We'll see how it goes. But so you can't have both. These two things cannot be happening at the same time. If the cancer death rate is falling, then cancer shouldn't be overtaking the cardiovascular disease as the leading cause of death in Western rich countries. What was the other thing I was going to say? Oh yeah, so now there's another thing going on, and now I think basically they're saying that if you go to a hospital and you get diagnosed with cancer, you actually So I think your doctor actually in some states asks you whether you want this to be on your record of whether you have cancer or not. And they're trying to say that this is to avoid the insurance companies discriminating against you based on price. But in reality, what happens is that it artificially lowers the number of diagnoses of people with cancer. So even with this going on, we still have a study which says that cancer has overtaken cardiovascular disease as the leading cause of death. So you can imagine just how much worse the real situation is.
Do you want to talk about this testosterone one, and then we'll get on to super chats?
Yeah, so testosterone, as many people know, has a bad reputation in mainstream media. I mean, I'm sure people have seen the studies. It says it promotes the so-called bad boy behavior, which is cheating on your spouse, taking excessive risk in the financial industry, or really any industry, being aggressive, being impulsive, being unruly, being stubborn, essentially a wild man, right? And several studies have come out recently. This is not the first one, which basically said, well, and all the studies that actually, by the way, all the studies that claim that testosterone is responsible for these bad behaviors, all of them were observational. None of them were actually interventional studies. The reason this study is so important is because it actually pulls the data from two interventional trials where they administered men with testosterone, and they administered different dosages too, because some people may have countered by saying, well, you administered testosterone and you didn't see an increase in risk taking or increase in aggressiveness because the testosterone dose was very low. So in order to control for that, they actually had several groups, and each group had a successively higher dose of testosterone. None of the groups actually had a decrease in empathy. And empathy is, so far, has been claimed to be the most sensitive to the levels of testosterone. There are multiple studies that have come out which say basically that new fathers that whose testosterone levels do not drop tend to leave their partners and children, tend to, cheat a lot more often, tend to not care and not participate in the raising of the child, tend to be poor fathers, absent fathers. It's a very common political term, the absent father. Well, both of these studies found that that's not the case. And if anything, in some of the groups, the markings of empathy increased. So once again, I think the narrative that we're being fed through mainstream media, which is that to be a proper male is a bad thing, it's just turns out to be a house of cards that is slowly falling apart.
I'm going to have to get Neil deGrasse Tyson's view on this one before I accept what you're saying, Georgi.
For him to define whether this is proper science or not, right?
Okay, let me bring up
just one more. The elevated maternal estrogen is again linked to autism. This is a second study. 2 studies coming out in a matter of less than a month. I think we discussed like the previous one on the last podcast. And basically that other study implicated a number of different hormones and basically said, yes, progesterone, testosterone are also slightly positively correlated with autism, barely reaching statistical significance. But the previous study said the 3 estrogens, estrone, estradiol, and estriol, are very highly correlated with estrogen. This study actually repeated the methodology of the previous one and actually didn't find that progesterone and testosterone are associated with autism. If anything, they were negatively correlated. And of the 3 estrogens that the study looked at, it's basically the estradiol, which turned out to be highly predictive. Maternal estradiol levels during pregnancy turn out to be highly predictive of whether a child will later go on to develop autism. So 2 studies in a matter of less than a month are now pointing straight at estradiol, maternal estradiol. And then, by the way, these studies are not shy to call estradiol a stress hormone. And the explanation of this newer study is that the role of estradiol in the womb is actually to spur premature development of the fetus because the environment is sending signals that the environment is harsh. And the role of estrogen really is a stress hormone to trigger this premature development of the child so that it's better prepared to face the harshness of the world after birth.
Yeah, what a home run. But as the researchers looked at the steroid hormones that were measured, what we realized is that the higher estrogen levels being produced by the placenta actually may be stimulating the baby's development of his or her stress response. What a no-brainer. Yeah. Good job finding this. Also, I love that idea that the higher the estrogen goes, the more that it, like you said, is a signal from the environment that things are real bad. So procreate as fast as possible before you die. And then that ties kind of into being less discriminate about who you have sex with. And I mean, I know they found that in animal models, but I felt like that was real interesting.
Well, I mean, there are actually human studies that have looked at the correlation between birth control use and the number of sexual partners, right? Mm-hmm. And the correlation is there. Usually, and I don't mean this in any bad way, usually women who are on estrogenic birth control pills tend to have more sexual partners than women who are not. And the explanation that has been given so far is that, it's just because it promotes irresponsibility, and maybe these people they were just born this way, and they're poor citizens. They're uncontrollable. They're making bad choices. How about that? Maybe the reason is more physiological. Maybe that because estradiol is such a hormone that basically says life will be short and brutal. So how about you basically have intercourse with as many different partners as you can to maximize the chance that you're going to have an offspring that will survive.
And also, I mean, every probably video that you and I have ever done, somebody is asking about nofap or whatever. And I think if somebody is obsessed with sex, that could be a sign of high estrogen. And so just something to think, not so much judge masturbation, whether it's good or bad. I don't really care about judging somebody, but like more so the physiology of having like an insatiable interest in sex, I think is interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me what you're working on, and I'll pull up Super Chat.
You mean in terms of products?
Yeah.
Or okay, so a couple of things. As I mentioned on the last podcast, I'm basically working with two scientific groups in Bulgaria, and one of them is will be doing in vivo studies on the combination of progesterone and DHEA, and we're going to try and see if this can stop a really lethal cancer in mice. So that's kind of interesting. And also the group that's synthesizing new chemicals is working on synthesizing a new serotonin receptor antagonist, similar to cyproheptadine, but hopefully without some of the liver toxic side effects that Pete has mentioned about, and they're also publicized in the literature. And the second chemical that I'm working on is a chemical very similar to mildronate / meldonium. It basically does the exact same thing, but it has much higher affinity for that receptor that blocks the synthesis of the amino acid L-carnitine, and it should be able to achieve the same things with much lower dose, which should limit the likelihood of causing side effects. And there are a number of different things. I mean, there are other chemicals that I'm also working on. Pete mentioned in one of his interviews the chemical hyperforin, which is present in the herb St. John's wort, I believe. And the Russian scientists isolated the chemical in the 1950s, and then they discovered that this chemical is really a panacea for almost any psychiatric condition that they tried it on. And the mechanism of action is still not completely elucidated, but it looks like that chemical blocks the effects of serotonin, promotes the effects of dopamine and GABA, and also blocks the effects of glutamate and cortisol on the brain. So it really is like a very systemic chemical that seems to address most of these mediators of stress and promote the ones that are known to be beneficial for the functioning of the brain.
Sweet.
So
okay.
we're trying to isolate that and basically, turn it into a product, into a liquid product, so that people don't have to ingest kilograms of St. John's wort.
Sweet. Okay, so we don't really have that many super chats, so this should be quick. And I just want to say thank you to everybody. I just sent Ray a super chat thing for like $199, and so that was part of like the near $500 that we basically raised for him. So that's awesome. Thank you guys. First one is from Sandy, and she says, how to speed up healing of the stomach lining, inflammation, erosion, atrophy, taking famotidine, glycine, vitamin D. She says no H. pylori found, but the endoscopy did find a small hiatal hernia as well. Can I do anything for that too? Thank you.
Hiatal hernia is at this point being conclusively linked to elevated cortisol. In general, whenever there is a weakening of the esophagus, basically of the lining of the esophagus or of the sphincter, which separates the esophagus from the stomach, usually cortisol is involved. And I think there were some small-scale clinical trials back in the 1970s that used the cortisol blocker RU486 to actually reverse milder cases of hiatal hernia. So, aside from RU486, things like progesterone and DHEA, they're endogenous glucocorticoid antagonist in the body. And I would stick to the glycine as well, because hiatal hernia also tends to go hand in hand with GERD, the gastrointestinal reflux disease, which is now known to be inflammatory in origin. So if there is no H. pylori, I would stick to the famotidine just to take care of the GERD, because famotidine has been found to help the GERD, not because it blocks the acid, because when they use it in a dose that's too low to suppress the synthesis of gastric acid. Usually only 10 or 20 milligrams a day is sufficient to take care of GERD, yet they don't suppress the production of acid. In general, you don't want to suppress the production of acid. That's very important for digestion and for keeping the bacteria out of your small intestine. You don't want SIBO. So the famotidine and basically things that either inhibit synthesis of cortisol or block its effects, progesterone, DHEA, aspirin may even help. The chemical emodin from cascara is also a potent inhibitor of cortisol synthesis. The studies that I've seen point straight to hiatal hernia being driven by chronic stress. So anything that can be done to change the lifestyle or limit that chronic stress exposure should be beneficial. Cyproheptadine would be another good option because serotonin is, just as we discussed with Jahed, is heavily involved in the promotion of cortisol synthesis, even in the absence of a release of CRH. And cyproheptadine also has anti-inflammatory properties itself. It is a histamine 1 antagonist, and in general, just blocking the effects of serotonin tends to have an anti-inflammatory effect.
Sweet, thank you. So Sandy, $20. Thank you so much, Sandy. Send that straight to Ray. Pure Therapy for $2. Didn't Sandy? Thank you so much. Sincerely appreciate that. Christina Tomash for $199. I think. Thank you so much, Christina. But she didn't say anything. Steph for $2, and then for $20, and she says trying again. Thank you so much, Steph. You're an amazing moderator, human being. Sincerely appreciate it. Thank you so much. Do you want to take a call?
Sure.
Yep. Okay, I actually don't know how this is going to go because I have like kind of a new setup with Jahed, and so I guess we'll try things till they don't work. So,
just one other thing.
Yeah.
There was one study that I wanted to go over that we didn't cover. Remember, Ray had a newsletter about a very recent one about these nanoparticles that are in bugs and food and whatnot.
Yeah.
So as it turns out, he did mention actually talc directly in that newsletter several times. As it turns out, a really, really tiny amount of talc can apparently directly cause, quite reliably, diabetes type 2. And that's what the post is about. And talc is found in virtually all commercial foods and invariably, I think, in pretty much every pharma drug that's out there. And the amount that was sufficient to cause diabetes was really tiny. It was on the order of about 100 milligrams daily. And 100 milligrams you can actually get from just 2 or 3 pills. And many people, maybe unknowingly giving themselves diabetes simply by taking their pharmaceutical drugs. So I would strongly advise to check the label because FDA requires that all the excipients to be listed there. If your drug contains talc, make sure you talk to your doctor or change it, or if possible, switch to something else that doesn't contain it. So it's nothing to be. It's not a small thing. I mean, as it turns out, even a very tiny amount of this excipient, ubiquitous excipient, can be responsible for a large number of the type 2 diabetes cases that we're seeing around us. And the good news is Benadryl, diphenhydramine, it was able to completely reverse the effects of talc, which gives me hope that other histamine antagonists like cyproheptadine, doxylamine, the nortriptyline, amitriptyline, the tricyclic antidepressants, because they all have these anti-inflammatory, antihistamine effects, may be able to do the same.
Sweet. Yeah, I was thinking, like, the only things I feel like I've seen with talc are medications, right?
Actually, many supplements contain talc as well, because it's such a good anti-caking agent. So you typically have either silica, magnesium stearate, or talc, or titanium dioxide. Yeah. And yes, talc and titanium dioxide do tend to be present more in pharma drugs, and most of the supplements basically would have either silica or magnesium stearate. So the least dangerous of these is magnesium stearate. So actually, it'll probably not be too much of a jump to say that if talc has these effects, basically anything else, because talc is just silica, right? Mm-hmm. So all these supplements that are containing silica, they may be just as dangerous as these pharmaceutical drugs with titanium dioxide and talc.
I don't know if I'm going to have to check with Neil deGrasse Tyson on this one. Okay, so I have just put up the number for the call-in. We'll wait a few seconds to see if anybody calls in. I don't know how this is going to work. I hope it doesn't scramble our video or audio. But we'll see. So if you have any burning questions, give that number a call and we can talk. Do you have any plans this weekend, Georgie?
Yes, sleep as much as I can and then take care of 2 children.
Nice. That's a good plan. I just
No,
bought. Go ahead.
actually, the children are very stimulating for me because I find it a lot more easy to avoid TV and the excessive verbalization that we discussed with Jahed. I mean, these kids they have to spend time outside, otherwise they lose their mind in house when they're staying home. And I found out that, I mean, not surprisingly, when you are at home, you kind of gravitate towards either the TV or the radio. I don't know why, but it's something in the culture because you have to keep these kids' attention occupied, right? So what do? I mean, you can't play with them all the time. You have other things to do. So eventually, one way or another, they either turn on the TV or they get on the computer. So the only way to avoid this is by being outside with them. So they're actually helping me implement this deverbalization that I think society in general will benefit from if we could implement it.
Well, like when I am around my sister's daughter. Is that my niece? She's like lives in fantasy land. And so when you're talking to her, you also kind of entertain whatever style of thinking she has, which is fun I think it's fun. But so yeah, I'd probably be a better person if I was around a younger person most of the time.
It's just as somebody said, I think it was Pavlov who said the children are great because all they can do is tell you the truth, and then when there's nothing left, then they shut up. Like there's nothing else to say. Well, we as adults, I think we have this urge that is being ingrained in us that we should always be talking. We should always be telling a story because if you don't talk enough, people will think you're a moron or a dumb person and basically stop paying attention to you. I think the opposite is true. Like some of the most interesting people that I've known, they really speak.
I have something to say about that. We did just get a call, but they I think they hung up or something went wrong. So if that was you, call again. I have a friend. I'm so stupid. I forget what country he was from, but he has like a European family, and I think they were talking about some intense subject, and he's probably more similar to you and I. Like if you don't know something, you'll just say you don't know. But he quickly learned that his like family thought he was so stupid when he would say that he didn't know, and he told me that he didn't know there was a ramification for saying that. Like his family, I guess, would just be more pleased if he had just made up some shit about the topic or whatever.
Yeah, it's actually a huge cultural thing in I'm stereotypizing here, but it is a huge cultural thing in Southern Europe, which includes Bulgaria, and also Middle Eastern countries.
I think he's Hungarian, maybe.
Yeah. So Central Europe, okay, Central/Southeastern Europe, but basically, in these countries, you cannot appear to be uninformed. You might as well concoct a story, right, and tell like a confabulation, pull something out of thin air, and then just say I don't know. It's basically considered like the ultimate failure, the ultimate social failure. Like what kind of a man you are if you don't know the mass of the universe? Even if you come up with a completely bogus answer, it will still be considered better, especially if you say it with an aura of authority than if you said I don't know.
Okay, for the first time, we really haven't had any calls, and so maybe it's really late, and that's why nobody's calling.
Midnight, yes.
Yeah. Okay, guys. Thank you so much. Huge thank you to Jahed. I didn't even say it, but you got to like, comment, and subscribe to be entered in the Idea Labs giveaway. So I should probably write that in the comments. But please do that if you would like a supplement. Yeah, I don't have anything else except thank you to Jahed. Thank you, Georgi. You are the man. Thank you so much. Huge thank you to him for bearing with me while I got this rolling because I had a huge problem. But I think I fixed it. But any parting words, Georgi?
I mean, just as I said last time, as desperate the situation sounds, because that's how we started the podcast, right? Basically, they're saying that people need to realize that the environment is systematically murdering them. On the flip side, on the positive side, I would like to bring attention back to that study, which said that eventually, even your biggest enemies tend to die out. And then underneath, the great news is that there is so much new and beneficial and positive ideas flourishing. They're just waiting for the right moment to come to the surface. And I think we're we're getting closer to that moment. This house of cards cannot be maintained much longer.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Georgi Dinkov, idealabsdc.com, twitter.com/hateit. Thank you so much. You make this show worth doing, and huge thank you to Jahed for spicing things up. You guys are amazing. Thanks so much. Thank you so much to everybody watching. Sincere appreciation from the bottom of my heart. Also, thank you to the OG patrons, which got us here. I couldn't do any of this without them. Thank you guys so much. We'll be back in approximately 2 weeks. And thanks again. Have a great weekend. Take care. Goodbye.